Open the file. A 22-year-old student walks into a fast food bathroom in Seoul. 90 seconds later, he is dead on the floor, stabbed 9 times in the neck and chest. 2 other young men were inside that bathroom with him. Both of them walked out covered in his blood. And each one turned to the police and pointed at the other and said, "He did it." For the next 18 years, no one would answer for this murder. One of them would be acquitted by the highest court in the land. The other would flee the country on a passport that a prosecutor simply forgot to cancel. This is the Itaewon murder, Korea's most infamous whodunit. And it is the story of how a single folding knife and 2 teenage boys broke the Korean justice system for almost 2 decades. 2 suspects, 1 victim. No doubt at all that a murder happened, and, for the longest time, no way on earth to prove which of them did it. This is a case with everything, except the single thing that matters most in a courtroom: certainty. To understand this case, you first have to understand the place. In 1997, Itaewon was unlike anywhere else in South Korea. It sat in the shadow of a large United States military base in the heart of Seoul. For decades, an entire neighborhood had grown up around that base, shaped by it, dependent on it. Foreign restaurants, English signs, bars and nightclubs that stayed open until dawn. Soldiers, tourists, expatriates, and locals, all mixing in a way you saw nowhere else in the country. On a spring night in 1997, the district was doing what it always did: music spilling out of open doorways. Groups of young people drifting between bars and late-night food stalls. It was loud, alive, and completely anonymous, a place where anyone could vanish into the crowd. For most of Seoul, Itaewon felt like a small foreign country stitched into the middle of the capital. Different rules, different rhythm, a place where the ordinary lines of Korean society blurred. And that blurring matters, because it created a legal gray zone. When crimes involved Americans connected to the base, questions of jurisdiction, of who had the right to investigate and prosecute, could become tangled and slow. This was the era of a long-standing agreement between Korea and the United States that governed the treatment of American personnel and those connected to them. In practice, it meant that when an American, or someone tied to the American community, was caught up in a crime, the road to justice could run through 2 governments instead of 1. For an ordinary Korean family, that was a terrifying thing to discover. It meant the person who killed your son might not simply be a suspect down at the local police station. He might be someone the ordinary machinery of Korean law could barely lay a hand on. Itaewon was also home to a particular kind of young person: Korean-American kids, born or raised with 1 foot in each culture, fluent in both and fully at home in neither. 2 of them stand at the center of this story. Their names are Arthur Patterson and Edward Lee. Both were young Korean-American men who moved in the same Itaewon circles. They knew each other, they ran with the same crowd. Arthur Patterson was the younger of the 2. He was still a minor, a teenager, the son of an American civilian tied to the U.S. military presence. Edward Lee was a little older, a college student. On the surface, an unremarkable young man. They were friends, and on the night of April 3rd, 1997, they were together. That night, there was also a 3rd young man nearby, someone who barely knew either of them. His name was Cho Jung-pil. Before Cho Jung-pil becomes a case number, stop and understand who he actually was. He was 22 years old, a college student, the only son of his mother and father. By every account, he was an ordinary young man, with an ordinary life and an ordinary future stretching out ahead of him. Nothing about him was marked for tragedy. He was somebody's entire world. To his mother and father, he was not a case, or a headline, or a legal problem to be solved. He was their son, their only child, the center of everything they had built their lives around. Hold on to that image, because it is the thing most easily lost in the years of appeals and extraditions that follow. Underneath every legal argument in this story is a single, irreplaceable young man who is simply not here anymore. That night, he did what countless students his age do. He went out. He ended up at a Burger King in Itaewon, a bright, crowded, utterly normal fast food restaurant. At some point, he got up to use the bathroom. A completely mundane act. The kind of thing none of us think twice about. He had no connection to Arthur Patterson or Edward Lee. No argument with them. No shared history. No debt. No rivalry. No reason of any kind. Remember that. Because it is the coldest fact in this entire case. There was no motive. None. Cho Jung-pil was not killed out of hatred, or money, or revenge. He was, as far as anyone has ever been able to prove, simply in the wrong bathroom at the wrong moment. What happened inside that restroom took less than 2 minutes. Cho was attacked without warning and stabbed 9 times, concentrated in the neck and the chest. The wounds were fast, deep, and frenzied. He had no chance to defend himself, no chance to run. He collapsed and died there, on the tile floor of a fast food bathroom, for absolutely nothing. When he was found, the scene was chaos. A public restroom in a crowded restaurant, transformed in seconds into a place of violent death. People who had been eating a few feet away were suddenly witnesses to the aftermath of a killing. And the police arrived to what should have been a simple case. The crime was fresh. The suspects had not disappeared into the night. They were right there, in almost any other version of this story. That is where it ends, with a clean arrest and a clear charge. Here, it was only where the confusion began. And now we reach the problem that would define and poison this entire case. When it was over, 2 young men were in that bathroom with the dying victim, Arthur Patterson and Edward Lee. Both of them had Cho Jung-pil's blood on their bodies and their clothes. Both had been feet away when the knife went in. And there was no independent witness inside that room, no security camera on the act itself, no third party who saw whose hand held the blade. 3 people went in, 1 died. 2 walked out. And from the very first hour, those 2 told opposite stories. Patterson said Lee did it. Lee said Patterson did it. Each described himself as a horrified bystander, a boy who happened to be standing there when the other committed murder. This is where the case becomes a psychological puzzle as much as a legal one. Somewhere in those 2 accounts was the truth, and a lie told with total conviction. One of these young men had just killed a stranger, and then, within minutes, had looked at the police and calmly blamed his friend. Think about the coldness that requires. Investigators sat these 2 young men down separately and listened to 2 mirror image stories. In each version, the narrator was calm, cooperative, even helpful. And in each version, the friend beside him was a monster. This is the true nightmare of a whodunit. Not a mystery with no suspects, but a mystery with exactly 2, standing shoulder to shoulder, each wearing the very same expression of wounded innocence. One of them was lying with astonishing composure. A young man who had just committed, or watched at arm's length, a brutal killing, and could still speak evenly to the police within the hour. That composure is itself a kind of evidence about the mind behind it. Consider what the killer did in the minutes after the stabbing. He did not run blindly into the streets. He stayed close enough to be caught, and then immediately began building a story. That is not panic. That is calculation, switched on with terrifying speed. So investigators had to turn to the physical evidence, and at first, that evidence pointed in confusing, contradictory directions. And the earliest handling of the scene did not help. In those first crucial hours, the chance to lock down exactly what happened, to preserve every trace in its original place, is painfully fragile. Once it slips, no amount of later brilliance ever fully recovers it. Here's what they could establish for certain. The weapon was a folding knife, and that knife belonged to Arthur Patterson. After the killing, that knife was thrown away. Blood was washed off. Evidence was deliberately destroyed in the immediate aftermath. And Patterson was the one tied to disposing of the weapon and cleaning up the scene. That much was clear, but the central question, who actually drove the blade into Cho Jung-pil's body, remained agonizingly unclear. Owning the knife is not the same as swinging it. The blood told part of the story, but not the crucial part. In a small, enclosed bathroom, blood from a frenzied stabbing does not settle neatly on the attacker alone. It sprays. It transfers. It reaches everyone standing close. So the simple fact that both boys were bloodied did not, by itself, single out the killer. It was consistent with one of them stabbing while the other stood far too near. And it was consistent, at least in theory, with the reverse. That ambiguity created in a cramped room in the space of 90 seconds is exactly what the entire Korean justice system would then spend 18 years trying and failing and finally managing to resolve. Now watch the decision the prosecution made, because this single choice shaped the next 18 years. Prosecutors looked at the two boys, weighed the evidence, and decided that Edward Lee was the killer. They committed to that theory. They charged Edward Lee with murder. The full weight of the crime landed on him. And Arthur Patterson, the boy whose knife it was, the boy who helped destroy the evidence, was charged only with lesser offenses: destroying evidence and carrying an illegal weapon. Understand the enormous gamble buried in that decision. They pinned the murder on one boy and treated the other as little more than a cleanup man. If they had guessed wrong about which teenager actually held the knife, then the real killer had been charged with almost nothing, and the law would let him go. At first, the gamble seemed to pay off. In an early trial, Edward Lee was convicted of murder. The system appeared to have its answer. But then it began to come apart, thread by thread. Lee appealed, and the case climbed all the way to the Supreme Court of Korea. In 1998, that court delivered a decision that stunned the public. Edward Lee was acquitted, cleared of the murder. The reason was a principle at the heart of criminal law: reasonable doubt. The courts concluded that the evidence, the blood spatter, the positions of the bodies, the conflicting accounts, could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Lee was the one who stabbed Cho. It was not a finding that Lee was innocent in some absolute sense. It was a finding that the state had not proven him guilty to the standard the law demands. And that distinction matters enormously. For the public, this was almost impossible to swallow. A young man was dead. Everyone agreed that one of two people had killed him. And yet the courts were saying they could not be certain enough to convict the one who stood trial. This is the hard edge of a principle designed to protect the innocent. Better that a guilty person walk free than an innocent one be condemned on doubt. It is a noble rule. But set against a grieving family and an undeniably real body, it can feel like a wound, because it exposed the trap the prosecution had built for itself. They had charged only Lee with murder. They had never charged Patterson with the killing at all. So when Lee was acquitted, there was suddenly no one left facing a murder charge. The one person still legally exposed, Patterson, had only ever been accused of the lesser crimes. For destroying evidence and the weapon, Patterson received a short sentence, around 18 months. And then, in 1998, he was released early under a general amnesty. He walked out, stepped back, and absorbed where this left things. A 22-year-old had been stabbed to death in a public bathroom. Two people had been in that room. One was acquitted. The other served about a year and a half for cleaning up. And now both of them were completely free. In the eyes of the law, at that moment, no one had murdered Cho Jung-pil. The crime existed, but the criminal did not. And in Korea, as in much of the world, an acquittal is, in general, final. You cannot simply retry an acquitted person for the same crime every time a new argument comes along. That protection, against being placed twice in jeopardy for one offense, is a cornerstone of the system. It exists to stop the state from hounding a citizen forever. But in this case, it also meant that the door on Edward Lee had, for all practical purposes, swung shut. If Lee was the killer, the law had already let him go and could not easily reach back for him. For his parents, this was not the end of a nightmare. It was the beginning of one that would consume most of the rest of their lives. And unbelievably, the case was about to get worse, because of what happened in 1999. After his release, Arthur Patterson was still in Korea, but he was under a travel ban while prosecutors considered whether they could still come after him. Here is the thing about a travel ban. It is not permanent. It has to be actively renewed. It carries an expiration date. And in 1999, a prosecutor failed to renew Patterson's travel ban in time. The paperwork was simply not done. The ban lapsed, and Arthur Patterson, holding a valid passport, walked into an airport, boarded a plane, and flew to the United States. Let that fully sink in. The one remaining figure in Korea's most notorious murder case left the country because of a missed administrative deadline. Not a daring escape, not a forged document, a form that a government office failed to file on time. By the time anyone realized what had happened, Patterson was already gone. On the other side of the Pacific, beyond the easy reach of Korean law, the scandal of it was almost unbearable. This was not a fugitive who slipped through a net by cunning or courage. He walked out through the front door of an airport, entirely legally, because the state had forgotten to lock it. The questions poured out. How could a case this notorious be left to hang on a single unrenewed form? Who exactly was responsible? And why, after everything, had the system been so careless with the one suspect it still had within its grasp? For Cho Jung-pil's family, this was a second death, the death of any remaining hope that the system would deliver an answer. And so the case went cold. Not because it was unsolvable, but because it had been mishandled at nearly every turn. The two young men who had been in that bathroom were both free, one in California, one in Korea, and a mother and father were left with a grave and no name to attach to it. For a decade, that is where it stayed, a national wound that had scarred over, but never healed. Then, in 2009, something tore it back open, a feature film. A dramatization of the case was released in Korean cinemas, retelling the murder and the failure that followed. It put the whole story back in front of the entire country. The unanswered question. The botched prosecution. The boy who flew away on a lapsed travel ban. All of it, suddenly alive again in the public imagination. Audiences walked out of cinemas asking the very same furious question the victim's family had been asking for years. And now that anger had numbers behind it. Public attention became public pressure. And public pressure is one of the few forces on earth that can move a case everyone else has given up on. Public anger surged. How had this been allowed to happen? Why had no one paid for the death of Cho Jung-pil? How could a suspect simply leave? And under the weight of that renewed outrage, prosecutors finally reopened the file. This time, they made a fundamentally different choice. The choice they should arguably have made from the beginning. They indicted Arthur Patterson for the murder itself. Not for cleaning up, not for the weapon, for the killing. But now there was a new and enormous obstacle. Patterson was no longer in Korea. He was a free man, living in the United States. To put him on trial, Korea would first have to physically bring him back. And that meant extradition, a process that is slow, legally complex, and never guaranteed. Extradition rests on a treaty between two nations, and on the second nation agreeing that the case is strong enough and fair enough to hand over one of the people living on its soil. The United States did not have to say yes. Korea would have to convince it, step by legal step. Korea filed a formal extradition request with the United States government. And what followed was years of legal warfare, fought across an ocean. In 2011, Arthur Patterson was arrested in Los Angeles, the first concrete step in bringing him back. In 2012, a United States federal court ruled that he could be extradited to South Korea to face the murder charge. But Patterson's lawyers fought that ruling at every turn. They filed petitions. They appealed. They invoked every protection the American legal system offered, and each one bought more time. Years slipped by inside courtrooms in California, an ocean away from the small bathroom in Itaewon, where Cho Jung-pil had bled to death. And through all those years, a quiet act of preservation was taking place in Korea. The physical evidence from 1997, the samples, the records, the case materials, had to survive intact, sealed away, waiting for a trial that might never come. Because without it, extradition would have been meaningless. You cannot retry a murder from 2 decades earlier on memory alone. The old evidence would have to speak again, in a modern courtroom, to a new generation of judges who had been children when Cho Jung-pil died. Finally, in September of 2015 it happened. 18 years after the murder, Arthur Patterson was extradited to Seoul to stand trial. He would answer for the killing at last, and this time, the prosecution was determined not to repeat the catastrophic mistake of the first time around. The trial ran for about 4 months, and Patterson held to the story he had told from the very first hour, back when he was still a teenager. He was innocent, he insisted. Edward Lee was the real killer. He had only been a bystander, a frightened kid caught in the aftermath of someone else's crime. But this time, the case had something it had lacked before. Edward Lee testified. The man, once convicted of this very murder, then acquitted by the Supreme Court, now took the stand as a witness against Patterson. And Lee told the court that he had clearly seen Arthur Patterson turn toward Cho Jung-pil and stab him. The prosecution rebuilt its case, this time around the right defendant. The knife that belonged to Patterson. The wounds. The blood. The positions of 3 young men in a small, enclosed room. Now, decades later, that same physical evidence could be re-examined with the tools of a new era. Questions of blood pattern and wound angle that had been argued to a standstill in the 1990s could be revisited with fresher eyes and sharper methods. And the passage of time cut in an unexpected direction. Edward Lee, no longer at any risk of being retried himself, could finally speak plainly about what he said he saw, without the shadow of his own murder charge hanging over every single word. And on January 28, 2016, the court delivered its verdict. Arthur Patterson was found guilty of the murder of Cho Jung-pil. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The conviction was appealed, and it was ultimately upheld. After 18 years, the case finally had a legal answer. For the family sitting in that courtroom, the verdict was not a triumph. You cannot call it that. It was something quieter and far heavier. The simple, exhausted relief of a question, asked for 18 years, finally answered out loud. But look closely at the price of that answer. 18 years. 2 trials aimed, at first, at the wrong shape of the crime, a suspect who left on a forgotten passport. An acquittal that, right or wrong, meant a man was tried, convicted, and then cleared, while the case stayed open behind him. And through all of it, a family that spent nearly 2 decades fighting, not for revenge, but simply to have a name attached to the death of their son. Because that is the part of this story that too often gets lost. Cho Jung-pil's parents were at the center of this fight the entire time. They pushed, they protested. They demanded that the case not be quietly buried when the institutions around them wanted to move on. Much of the reason this case was ever reopened at all is that they refused to let it die. An ordinary mother and father forced to become public campaigners because the system that should have protected their son had failed him at nearly every step. And this case forced Korea to confront something uncomfortable about that system. The failure that let Patterson escape was not the work of a criminal genius. It was a missed deadline, an unrenewed document, a single piece of bureaucratic negligence. The Itaewon murder became a symbol of how justice can be lost, not to a mastermind, but to a form that nobody filed on time, and of how brutally hard families must fight to correct that kind of failure. The Itaewon murder now sits alongside Korea's other great justice failures as a lesson written in a family's suffering. It is studied, argued over, and remembered. It changed the way prosecutors think about travel bans and flight risks. It became a kind of shorthand in Korea for a system that can do everything except the one small essential thing on time. And 18 years is not an abstraction. It is childhoods that grew into adulthood, parents who grew old, an entire era of a country passing by, all while one mother and one father waited to hear a court say aloud the name of the person who took their son. Today, Arthur Patterson is serving his sentence for the murder of Cho Jung-pil. Edward Lee was acquitted, and in the eyes of the law, he is an innocent man. Cho Jung-pil has been gone for more than a quarter of a century now. He was 22 years old, an only son, a student who walked into a bathroom and never walked back out. For 18 years, his own country could not say who killed him. In the end, it finally did. But only because 2 grieving parents would not allow the file to close. Some cases are solved by evidence, some by confession. This one was solved by a mother and a father who simply would not give up. I'm telling the stories the rest of the world never heard. If you want the next file, subscribe. It's already open.